Welcome to Birkbeck Inspires series, and today Rachel, Lewis and I are going to be talking about preparing for a new way of working. So the Birkbeck Inspires series is a series put on by Birkbeck covering lots of different departments, and it's aimed to inspire thought, inspire learning, and excite curious minds. And I'm absolutely delighted to be talking about some of the work that Rachel and I have been doing over the last while. So Rachel, Lewis and I both work in the Department of Organisational Psychology, and our research and consultancy is focused on improving health and wellbeing at work. And throughout all of our work, what we're really interested in doing is encouraging and supporting employees, line managers and professionals to have and lead healthier working lives. We also run the Professional Doctorate program at Birkbeck in organisational psychology, and we job share in our roles. And we have a full-time role that we share at Birkbeck. We also are directors at Affinity Health at Work. And so in terms of what we're going to be looking at today, we are looking at how we are working through the pandemic and how we can prepare for a new way of working. Over the last few months, all of us have been impacted in many, many different ways, and there's not one aspect of our lives and our working lives that hasn't been impacted by the pandemic. And what this has meant is that everyone has very different situations. So our diverse situations and our diverse needs have been amplified. And what we can see is this leads us to have a very complex way of working, and we need to prepare to work perhaps very differently in the future. So within the context of work, what we can see is that people have continued to work in their usual working lives. They've continued in their usual job or their workplace. So, for example, our refuse collectors, are some of our teachers, some of our hospital workers, but with very different situations. We can also see that some people have continued working in their roles, but in very altered jobs or workplaces. So, for example, those of us that are working from home or may have been redeployed into a different role. And then we have many people who've got a job, but perhaps aren't working at the moment. So those people who are furloughed or starting to come back from furlough. And then we also have people who are losing their job. And just in the car, I was listening to another round of redundancies that are coming out from Pizza Express and other big names that we know. So within the context of work, we have many, many different situations that people are working through. And this gives us a range of different challenges that we need to think about how we prevent there being a them and us, how we ensure that people's mental health and physical health are managed during this difficult process. So in terms of these different contexts, what we see is we have those people who are working from home. We have the challenge of thinking, how do we bring those people back into the workplace or not as the months go on? For those people who have not been working, we have this challenge of thinking about how we bring them back into work, how we return to work. And we know from sickness absence research that can be a very challenging process, going from not working and not being around that work contact and work people into the workplace. And then for those who've continued to work, we have the challenge of making sure that we prevent burnout, but also ensuring that we have the whole group of our workforce pulling together and ensuring that we don't create these chasms as we go forward, where people have very different needs and different situations that they're working in. And so in this, what we can see is we have a huge amount of change going on. And whilst there is a lot of negative impact, what we can also think about is the possibility of the pandemic leading to inclusive and healthier ways of working. And so with these rapid and significant changes, there are some really interesting and unique opportunities to think about the way that we would redesign work. And I think one of the things that's really important is that we take a pause and prepare for this new environment that we're going to be working in, so that we can really make the most of these benefits that could be accrued. And so today, Rachel and I are going to be talking specifically around the benefits that may be accrued from working at home, remote working, and flexible working, but also this increased prioritization of mental health, and also the return to work practices that we're all going through, and we're all listening to in the news and seeing in the papers, and the benefits that that might bring for us in terms of a more inclusive and a healthier way of working in the future. So I'll hand over to Rachel, who's going to be talking about the benefits of working from home.
Yeah, so as Jo's already said, and as we all know, there's been a massive shift to working from home during the pandemic. The evidence suggested before the pandemic that most of us in workplaces wanted more flexibility at work. So not necessarily working from home. Flexibility covers so many different types of work arrangements, but most of us wanted this. And obviously we had the legislation to say we had a right to ask for flexibility. But actually the data showed that not many organizations were offering that. And actually it was often given as this idea that it was a perk to some, rather than offered as a privilege or an opportunity for all. It's now the case that over 50% are working from home, and it's estimated that will continue. That will continue to be a norm. It's going to be really hard, isn't it, for organisations to turn around after this situation and say no to flexible working, because we have seen that it is a necessity. It is for a sustainable strategy, and that in so many conditions, we've spoken to so many clients, haven't we, Jo, over the last weeks and months, where they never imagined that these jobs could be done from home, and now they have been. So it's going to cause a shift in how organisations see and enable flexibility for employees. Working from home specifically can have lots of advantages. What I would say as the caveat to this kind of literature is that when working from home literature tends to have been created in a situation what we'd say normal times, and often also where people have chosen to work from home. So we do have to say as a caveat, these findings, which were findings of an evidence review that Jo and I did, may not apply to this COVID situation where we haven't necessarily chosen this, and also really importantly where we're often doing this full time rather than blended. So the evidence shows that working from home can improve our well-being. It can make us more satisfied with our job. It can have positive impacts in work-life balance. So we think of avoiding things like the commute. There have been lots of studies that have shown actually performance and productivity gains. A little caveat to that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And we also see reduced absenteeism levels. Again, a caveat to that could be that we see reduced absenteeism but increased presenteeism. So essentially you don't not turn up to work when you don't have to go to work in that sense. There are also real benefits, and we've seen this really underreported in terms of the benefits this offers for people with, for instance, disabilities or chronic illnesses, or who have caring responsibilities, or people who have neurodiversities. And the reason being for these groups of people that they are more able to control their environment. So they perhaps have the organizational setup, they feel the home setup, they feel safe at home. They don't have to manage the journey in. They don't have to manage the stairs if the lift isn't working. And for neurodiverse groups, that might be that they can manage their own social interaction and be able to enable that in a way that's positive for them. But also working from home is associated with increased musculoskeletal pain. So what I'm sure many of us have appreciated is when we're working from home, we might not be working on our ergonomically designed desk and chair that we might be used to at the office. So So yes, musculoskeletal pain is a burden. It's also really associated with work intensification. So because of that blurring of the boundaries between work and home, we work longer hours, and there is strong evidence to show that people work longer hours while they're working from home. And that's where I go back to that caveat I said earlier about performance, is that potentially performance and productivity could have risen because people are working more intensively and longer. And there's also the risk of isolation if it's not managed carefully. Social isolation can, of course, lead to loneliness, which has long-term both mental and physical and physiological impacts. As I say, though, working from home and working flexibly is going to have to be part of organisations' strategy ongoing. Siemens, as you can see, have already had a change, so that they are embarking on a work from anywhere rethink, and we're going to see many organisations follow that type of approach. I think what I'd say is to realise the benefits of working from home. We need to start thinking about looking at the evidence. So the evidence at the moment suggests that working from home is you only have that positive benefit of it if you're not doing it all the time. So the optimum is kind of 2 or 3 days at home and then 2 or 3 days in the office. What I would say to that is that it's not set cut and dried. So there's some evidence that shows that this is not such of an impact if you increase your social connection. So whatever happens, what we need to do if we are thinking about full-time working from home is we really need to think about the conditions under which people are doing that. We need to put in place strategies so that people can actually understand whether they're suitable. So we know lots of evidence on the context, on the individual differences, on the type of teams, on the type of situations, and there needs to be some strategies whereby people are able to assess in perhaps a kind of conversation that's had at work. We need to understand we're going to hear this mention of split teams a lot more often. So this idea of teams would come in at different days to work and understand how they will work and go forward. There will need to be risk assessments in exactly the same way as we'd have in our office, but risk assessments that enable better ergonomic working and actually get people to encourage. There are lots of different hacks and things we can do to improve the way that we work and improve our ergonomic health and safety when we're at home. And I think importantly, what the research on remote working shows is that leaders actually need to display additional and slightly different behaviours when they're remote working. Also, that leaders and managers work harder when they're remote working because of a number of things. For instance, managing the logistics of teams working in different ways and different times, but also because of the need to talk to people one-to-one. And therefore, what we need to do is equip organisations with both skills for managers and also resource for managers and leaders to enable this. I think one of the other things we've seen as positive in terms of changes has been the increased prioritisation of mental health. So we've seen some evidence that people are starting to think about mental health as a sign of as a core organisational strategy. So I did some work with a client a couple of weeks ago who asked the question to 1,000 employees of whether mental health was now going to be seen as a core organisational priority, and over 60% of organisations in this poll said that they were. It's not obviously academic research, but it's an indication people are starting to recognise that mental health is something that is embedded in all organisations and we need to consider. So organisations are getting better at being aware of the signs and the signals, so increasing in mental health awareness. One thing that we've seen from the pandemic is there's been an increase in lived experience of mental ill health. So we saw the report from a couple of weeks ago, but also that Mental Health Foundation have been tracking mental health over time throughout the pandemic. So mental health foundations say 62% of people reported feeling anxious due to the pandemic. The Mind report suggests that around 60% again of people are coming back to the office with worse mental health than when they left. So not only are we going to have this increase in organisations prioritising, but we're also going to have many more people that are actually suffering from mental ill health when they return. So what we need to equip individuals with the ability to manage their own mental health. So the awareness of that, but also a toolbox. So that might be resilience, or it might be lots of different evidence-based strategies and resources and tools that we can give. We need to enable managers in this flexible working. Again, lots of the visualization and the face time with employees is going to be remote, and also they're going to bear the brunt of being able to recognize this in their employees. So we need to be able to train them so that managers are better able to manage employees, to prevent and reduce work stress. We also need to think of how we affect our job design. So not just thinking about how we treat and deal with those who are suffering at the moment, but how do we look at increasing our preventative action? So how do we look at improving the way that we all work in order to better equip people, in order to protect people? So that might be, for instance, looking at the amount of control people have, looking at the amount of social support they might have. And there are lots and lots of tools out there for what we can do with this. Jo's going to now talk about return to work.
Yeah, so this picture that's up here is from a recent project where I'm not sure if any of you have been unwell or have been a manager of somebody who's unwell. But this is really what we see when people are feeling worried and concerned at home. They might be feeling that everything's too much. They can't describe how they're feeling. They don't know if they're going to lose their job. They're unable to concentrate. They may feel unmotivated or lethargic. And as Rachel was saying, what we know now is that many people are in this situation where things are actually feeling on top of them a lot of the time. Uncertainty is difficult to manage. Financial situations are difficult to manage. Concern about what's going to be coming. And then on the manager side, what we often see is confusion about where that comes from and what that is. So not sure whether the individual is just not interested in the job, perhaps seeing the mistakes and trying to rush on to find a better way of doing the task rather than taking that step back and thinking about what's really going on. And one of the things that really strikes me as being interesting at the moment is we're all that absent employee. So in the past, what we see when somebody's returning to work following a period of illness is that individual is on their own, possibly being supported by their line manager, their friends, their colleagues, but they return into a situation that's relatively stable. Whereas at the moment, we're all in this phase of feeling a little bit confused, exhausted, irritable, unable to concentrate an awful lot on our plate. And at the same time, as a manager, you have that going on, but also needing to bring the team together. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is the optimism that, as awful as this situation might be, we can all develop some empathy around thinking what it might be like needing to return to work and being apprehensive about it, needing to perform and present yourself as an employee and professional, but being concerned that you perhaps don't have 100% of the strength that you did when you were feeling completely well. And so this picture really gives a little insight into that. But during the pandemic, it would be remarkable if you've made it through this far and continue with that strength to feel a little lost in the journey. And what we can see from learnings from occupational health, from human resources, from health and safety, is the principles of good return to work are are learned from what we can see through managing good sickness absence processes, but they can be applied to those people who are returning from furlough. They can be applied to those of us who are looking to go back into the workplace. And also, so important for those of us that are continuing to work at home, so that we continue to keep and connect those relationships while we're out of the workplace, so that they're still there when we return. And so when we look at the principles of good return, one of the biggest predictors for a successful return is the relationship that people have as they're off work, and the relationship they had prior to their absence. And so if we take that as a learning now, what we really need to prioritize at the moment, and before people come back from furlough leave, before people go back into the workplace, is this talking and connecting. If we understand people's concerns while they're off and while they're away from the team, we're much better positioned to really be able to support them through that return journey. So talking and connecting is absolutely key. We also know that planning and preparing is really important, and many organisations have started to put this into place, particularly as they're moving back into the workplace, thinking about how we can help our employees plan and prepare for what's coming. What is it about the way that we've navigated our lives over the last while that we want to keep? What is it that we might want to change on our return? When we're thinking about our journey into work, what might we need to think about to prepare so that we can manage our anxiety as we're going in? What is it that we're maybe concerned about when we get into the workplace that we might want to ask about and prepare for those changes, so that we're not feeling vulnerable and confused and disempowered when we return? So this planning and preparing is absolutely key, and we can do that both in terms of the work context, but we can also do that in terms of what's going on at home. So those of us that have maybe got into different routines when we've been at home with our children, with our exercise, with our social worlds, what is it that we might need to change as we start changing the way that we work, and how are we going to manage that so it doesn't come as a surprise and an extra load that we need to manage? One of the other things that's really encouraged is a return to work conversation. So often when we're talking about sickness absence, we'll talk about a return to work interview. My feeling is that the last thing you want when you're feeling a little bit vulnerable is an interview, but rather a conversation to say, where are we at? What's going to be workable now? And that's so important, whether somebody's coming back from furlough, whether it's somebody coming back from a position where they've been redeployed for a period of time, or coming back into the workplace. What's going to be the way that we want to work over the next few months? And perhaps we also need to think about building our time up gradually. The whole idea of commuting, I don't know if any of you have been on drives recently when we haven't been driving for a long period of time. It's exhausting. Going on the tube is going to be exhausting. So taking time to really think about how we build up our resilience and our robustness to get back into our old work patterns is going to be important, and factoring that in that initial conversation can be helpful. Taking things one step at a time is crucial. So everything around us is changing, but nothing is changing. We're still doing a lot of the work that we did, perhaps in different ways. And so constantly thinking about what is working, what needs to be changed is really important. And taking one step at a time so that we're breaking things down into manageable chunks can be really helpful, particularly when we've got a lot of um, mental unrest. So if we're feeling stressed, if we're feeling anxious, that can be something that can help us maintain our focus. We can also learn from sickness absence research that it's absolutely vital to monitor and review. So as people go through, we can see that some weeks may be easier than others, some tasks may be easier than others to pick up in different ways. And so monitoring and reviewing and keeping it an open learning journey is really important. And through this, what we know from managing absence is everyone's journey is different. And what we know from the pandemic research so far is everyone's journey has been different. And so this really demands us to step back a little bit and be really kind and patient. Otherwise, things could go really horribly wrong. And so, if we're looking at ourselves and thinking, how would we like to be treated through this? We can then apply that to others. So you'll see there we've got a little picture of um, the igloo, which in previous sessions we talked about. But the igloo is a systems framework that we've been working on with colleagues from the University of Sheffield, so Professor Karina Nielsen. And what this does is suggest that rather than the individual having to find their path all the way through, we really need to make sure that we have a whole system of support in place. So there are things that the individual can do, there's things that our group can do to support us, there are things our leaders, our managers can do to support us, and so there are systems and policies that need to be in place for the organisation to support us. And we've got lots of free resources around that can help give good prompts to highlight good practice on return. And so with all of these things, I think we're not naive in that there are certainly a number of challenges that everyone are going through. But certainly with return to work, what we believe is that this offers hope for managing future returns. From the research that we've done, often managers will draw from personal experience, maybe a colleague that had a significant illness or a wife that returned from maternity leave, and they draw on those return experiences to inform their own practice. And now that we've been through this journey all together in very different ways, it really offers hope for managing future returns in a more empathic way and managing that discomfort and that uncertainty and acknowledging it. Also recognizing the signs of struggles, knowing that we've all been through different struggles can be helpful in recognizing those in others. And also being much more able to have open conversations because we have more points of reference that we can draw into those conversations to help others through those transitions. So with the three topics that we've discussed, there are so many opportunities that if we can position it appropriately moving forward and we really take time to think about what we've learned and where we need to go next, there could be some really great opportunities ahead for designing good work, for supporting people on their return, and also creating an environment that acknowledges difference and provides opportunities for people to work in more inclusive and healthier ways as we move forward.